Hello, everybody, and welcome to CIJ Summer Conference. It's day 2, and we are very, very excited to have Ron Nixon here, who is Global Investigations Editor for Associated Press. And he's going to talk to our old friend, Sheila Coronel, who runs Investigative Journalism program at Columbia University Journalism School. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you want to tweet, please do. Use the hashtag CIJ Summer. And also, if you want to ask questions, and I hope you have many, please use, if you're on Zoom, the Q&A function, not the chat, because it's much easier. You can upvote questions and stuff like this. And now I'll leave you in with Sheila and Ron.
Thank you, Marina. Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be having this conversation with Ron Nixon, who is the Global Investigations Editor of the AP. I will not make an extended introduction. Instead, I will have Ron tell you his story himself. But Ron this year received the first News Leader of the Year award from the US News Leaders Association for his strong leadership during this extraordinary year, his transformative leadership of the AP, and his ability to infuse the broader AP with greater investigative capacity. So Ron, welcome. And before we start, I'd like you to tell us about your origin story. Every journalist has a story of how he or she got into journalism. Tell us yours.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me here this morning. And thank you, Sheila, for agreeing to do the Q&A here with me. So yeah, I started out as a music major in college. I studied music theory and composition, and that was going to be my career. I wanted to do write music for movies and for television. And so, again, I thought that was what I was going to do until I joined the Army National Guard to help pay for college, and happened to pass by this little publishing company while over a weekend. Went in, talked to them. I'd written a little book. Well, it really wasn't a book. It was like a bad manuscript, and thought, hey, this is an opportunity to get somebody to publish it. So I walked in, talked to the people there, and they told me, no, we don't publish books. We're a newspaper. And so they told me to come back maybe next year, and I could be an intern there to write music reviews, among other things. And so that's how I got started in journalism, and it sort of grew from there. But I had no intention of being a journalist.
So this was in South Carolina,
right?
And it was tell us about the newspaper that you worked for initially. Yeah.
So the newspaper that I worked for initially was a small Black-owned newspaper. It's called Black News, ironically enough, and it had 7 editions, but they just changed the front page, but everything else is the same. And it was a good starting place because the editor that I worked for was someone who had worked in, daily newspapers, and he had worked for the Negro Associated Press, which was like during segregation, the Black version of the Associated Press back during segregation. And so he taught me a lot, and I basically again started writing about music. And my first interview that they sent me to was to interview the singer who had come to South Carolina in 1987 to perform. And some of you may have heard of her, Whitney Houston. And her opening act was Jonathan Butler, the South African jazz guitarist. So I went to interview her for my very first interview. And it was really bad because, again, I had no training as a journalist, and I ended up answering her questions rather than her answering mine. So it was really, it was awful. I got to say, my initial interview in journalism was really bad. But fortunately for me, the newspaper sent me back to interview her after I bombed, and she agreed, and it turned out a little bit better. But I also got to talk to Jonathan Butler, which really introduced me to the country of South Africa. I knew about it, but didn't know as much, and had never met anyone from South Africa until Jonathan Butler. So that started a lifelong interest in the country.
How did you get from doing music reviews and interviews with the likes of Whitney Houston to being an investigative reporter?
Kicking and screaming. I was assigned to do a story over a holiday, and it was a basic story. I was going to look at the police in Columbia, South Carolina, handling of drunk drivers. And an advocacy group, an NGO here in the US, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, had given the police department handheld cameras to record people drinking over the holidays, and they were going to use those as public service announcements. So the police department gave me the video to help with the report, because I guess they saw it as like a real PR thing for them. And I didn't think much of it until I got a call from someone who said, "Have you seen the video?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Well, did you go all the way to the end and tell me what you see?" I scrolled all the way to the end, and they said, "You don't have the full video." So they told me to drive the next morning to the next town over, West Columbia, South Carolina, which is a separate city, and go to the Waffle House, which is a fast food breakfast place that's mainly in the southern part of the United States. Went over, the waitress there handed me a brown paper bag with a videotape in it. And the videotape basically showed the cops had accidentally recording themselves beating an African-American while they were trying to get his nephew into an ambulance. Paramedics were trying to get his nephew into an ambulance. His nephew had overdosed, and he was trying to just deal with it. And they just beat, and the cop that they just videotaped themselves beating this guy. So I did the story, and not really thinking much about it. It was kind of straightforward, not like your classic investigative piece, because I didn't really know anything about like how to do an investigative story. But the story just took off, and the cop ended up, being charged. And so here we are with this little Black newspaper with this kind of impact, because the Daily and then the TV stations and everybody picked up on it.
Ron, that story is still the same story you're writing about today, isn't it?
Yeah, ironically, here we are in the, like 33 years later, and we're still dealing with the same issue of police brutality, particularly against people of color in the US.
Is there a difference, looking back at that time, in reporting on these issues of police brutality, especially against people of color? What has changed, or what has remained the same in terms of the way we investigate those types of stories and the way we tell them?
Right. I think the main thing that has changed is the technology that everybody has. Instead of, those handheld cameras that Mothers Against Drunk Driving had given the police, we all have these handheld cameras on our phones now. And so this is something that has really changed this, because there was a time where people would allege police brutality, and there would be like this collective sigh, like, yeah, they're just complaining. But now you can actually see it from the George Floyd to other incidences in the US and around the world, actually, where you actually see these things. So that's what's changed. What hasn't really changed is the way a lot of police departments operate and the way that the unions protect police officers that have been accused of this. Now, of course, everybody has the right to, an accusation is not proof, but even after there are where things have been verified, the unions still protect a lot of these officers.
Do you think we are in an inflection point when it comes to writing about police abuses? And do you think investigative reporting has a role there in helping bring about more systemic changes so that we don't tell the same story over and over again?
Yeah, I think we are. And I think that there's a number of things that have changed as a result of investigative reporting. Years ago, the Washington Post, for instance, Wesley Lowery and his colleagues, Stephen Rich and others, wrote about police shootings of Blacks. It was the first time that anyone had tried to collect nationally statistics on police shootings. And it had forced the federal government to actually start collecting this information. So that was a pivotal point in our coverage here. And one of the other things that I think that has happened is that reporters are more skeptical of initial statements by police departments about what happened in these cases. You saw with the George Floyd, there was initial thing that there was a person who had a medical emergency, and that was the extent of it. And so I think those two things have really changed how we cover police departments. But we've always investigated police brutality. But again, I think that the technology has really changed. I think there is more skepticism of these initial reports that we're getting from police department, and much more questioning of incidents now than in the past.
Let's talk about your own story, coming from a Black newspaper that certainly highlighted these things, and now these stories becoming more mainstream, right? What is the relationship between the Black press or the ethnic press and the mainstream media and this whole information ecosystem? Do you see that the Black press was as strong as it used to be, or is there a dearth now?
No, not at all. It has been gutted over time. And one, the Black press existed because people like myself in the past could not work at mainstream organizations like the New York Times or the Associated Press or the Washington Post. So this is where the Black journalists went to work. So you have, famous Black investigative reporters like Ida B. Wells, who never worked for a mainstream daily because she couldn't, because of segregation. So those organizations were the only outlets for Black or other people of color, because other ethnic groups also had their publications too, to cover what they saw as the gaps in coverage from mainstream organizations. Because a lot of mainstream organizations used to just would say Negro rapist or Mexican. I mean, they would, whenever there was a person of color involved in a crime or even accused of a crime, they would say the race there. And a lot of the news organizations too were complicit in some of the things that happened to people of color in this country. But as integration occurred, just like everything else with the Negro leagues in baseball, where your talent was now able to go to Major League Baseball, now your talent was able to go to these mainstream organizations like the Times and AP and others. So it has taken away a lot of the talent, and that's people should be able to go and work where they want to work. And that's a good thing. But at the same time, there are still some gaps in the coverage of communities of color in the United States. And I would say, in other countries too, that these organizations, media organizations, led by and owned by people of color, try to fill those gaps.
Ron, tell us about your own journey from the Black press to, the mainstream press, to the New York Times. Yeah.
Right. So, oh wow, that's a long journey. So let me say first that I had no intention of doing investigative reporting. That first story that I did when the cop was charged, I got a summons to appear in court because the police department wanted to know where I got the videotape from. And so I told my editor that, hey, listen, I got to go to court and tell them where I got the videotape. So I didn't know anything about protecting sources or anything like that because I had never been trained on it. And he was like, no, we don't do that. We protect our sources. We'll go to jail to protect our sources. And I was like, jail? Jail? There's no way. I'm not going to jail. Yeah, we protect our sources. We don't do that. So I go to the court. They postponed the hearing. And about 2 weeks later, I get another summons because they are going ahead with the hearing. Luckily for me, the police officer pleaded guilty before the trial, so I never had to testify because I didn't know what I would have said, to be honest. And so when the editor told me that this is what I was going to be doing because I seem to have a knack for it, I resigned because I did not want to do this and I did not want to be threatened with going to jail every time I did something. So he talked me into it and here we are today. But I went from there to a publication called Southern Exposure Magazine, which was like, getting a master's degree in investigative reporting because, I met a number of people there who have had an impact on my career. Mike Hudson, who is with ICIJ, was writing for the magazine. Eric Bates, who has worked for everything from Vanity Fair to other publications. Bob Hall, the founder of the magazine, is a MacArthur genius. Barry Yeoman, and who's one of the great narrative investigative journalists that I've ever met. And they all had an impact on my career. And actually, my next step was going to my first daily newspaper, and I was recruited there by Mike Hudson, who ironically also recruited me to the AP years later, like 2 years ago. But from there, I went to teach and train for investigative reporters and editors that a lot of people are familiar with. And after that, went to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, was there for almost 2 years before being recruited to the New York Times, where I remained for 14 years until 2.5 years ago, where Mike Hudson recruited me to the Associated Press to be an editor on the investigative team. And about a year ago, I became the top editor for the team.
Ron, when I met you at the middle of, maybe 10, 15 years ago, you were doing data. How did you get into data journalism?
Oh, it's embarrassing. So it all started back at that Black newspaper. I was doing a story about teacher salary, and this local, guy who considered himself a watchdog of the education system, he convinced me that teachers were lazy, that they only worked a certain amount of time during the year, and they were overpaid. And so I did a story about, teacher salaries, and again, we have to admit our mistake. It was really bad, and so I got a letter in the mail about a week after the story ran, criticizing the methodology that we used to show that teacher salary had risen over time. And the letter says, hey, math boy, ever heard of adjusting for inflation? And so, I was thinking to myself, no, actually, I have not. So the receptionist at the Black newspaper where I worked actually taught me how to use a spreadsheet and how to adjust, because she has a degree in accounting. So she taught me how to use a spreadsheet called QuatraPro, which I think it still exists, but this is well before Microsoft Excel. And it started from there. I started just looking at, procurement contracts and education data, environmental data, and it just grew and grew from there.
So you were largely self-taught, or at least taught by the accountant at your office.
Yeah, I later went to an IRE NICAR boot camp, but that was probably 10 years after I started. And IRE helped refine some of the skills that I had. But yeah, I was largely self-taught because remember, during those times, data journalism was kind of this, they didn't even call it data journalism, we called it CAR, computer system reporting. And it was kind of this like geeky thing that people weren't sure if it was journalism or not. And, there was argument about shoe leather reporting versus databases, arguments that seem ridiculous now, but that's where we were. So there were no courses to actually go to at that point.
So most journalists don't find data journalism to be a natural thing. I mean, was the learning curve for you initially really steep?
Well, I thought about it in a different way. Instead of thinking about it as maths, I thought about it as documents. And so instead of looking at stuff in the spreadsheet as a bunch of numbers, I just thought about it as these are documents.
From where there are numbers.
Yes.
Right. So Ron, you actually ended up doing training courses on data journalism as the training director for the IRE, right? Yeah.
Yes. And taught in several countries, including the UK. Because I thought it was an important skill to have, that I don't think we need to, I really dislike the term data journalism, and that's a personal preference, just because it seems to imply that there's like an other, but to me, it's just journalism. It's just another tool that we have to do investigative reporting.
So why did you decide to make the transition from being, a reporter to being an editor?
I was blackmailed. No, I'm kidding. Look, I really love the New York Times, and I love the job that I had there as a Homeland Security correspondent, the best beat I ever had in journalism, I would say. But when I first came to the Times, Matt Purdy, who was the deputy managing editor at the Times there, asked me, where do you see yourself in like 5 years or so? And I was like, well, in your job. It was the opportunity to deal more with international investigations, because I came to the AP first as the international investigator and leading a small team within the global unit, focused specifically on international journalism. And that's where my interests were going. And so I didn't necessarily want to be an editor, but it was a chance to work again with Mike Hudson, who, we hadn't worked together in years, since Roanoke Times. And but also just a great group of people that were on that team. People like Margie Mason and Robin McDowell, who did the Seafood from Slaves, Martha Mendoza. It was just like that collection of talent was like, how could you not want to be a part of that?
Well, I'll give you one reason. When you became editor, it was the start of a pandemic. I mean, how how did you manage? How did you manage that? And how did you set your priorities from when you got the position? Yeah.
Right. So I came, as I said, I came aboard as the international investigations editor, and then Mike decided to leave and go back to ICIJ. So that thrust me into the leadership, and it was just when, probably about a week before we all went home. And so the thing about it that that made it somewhat easier, I would say, is because we're not all in the same place anyway. So Zoom calls and things like that are normal for us. There are very few of my team that are actually with me in Washington, D.C. or in New York. They're spread out all over the country, and they're spread out all over the world. So that transition wasn't as hard because this is what we do anyway. But I did have to make some adjustments in terms of, now I'm leading this team. I need to set the priorities for what we're going to focus on. Obviously, the pandemic was going to be something, but we didn't want to lose sight of the other things that were going on in the world either. For instance, the palm oil investigation that we did, that was done in the midst of this pandemic, although a lot of the reporting had been done before that. Again, we didn't want to lose sight of all the things that were still going on in the world despite the pandemic. So we made decisions that we were going to cover the heck out of the pandemic, but we're also going to make sure that we did not gloss over other issues that were out there throughout the world.
What would you say are the key themes that your team has been focusing on? Certainly, slave labor or human trafficking from seafood from slaves was one. Were there others that were sort of like you say is classic AP global investigation?
I think AP, so Seafood with Slaves was done in 2016, well before I got here. So I have no credit whatsoever involvement anywhere in that. But I think that's one of the calling cards of AP has been its international investigations, particularly around supply chains and labor abuses in the supply chains. That's one of the hallmarks of AP investigations, particularly globally. I think one of the other things that there's been a lot of focus on looking at, race and ethnicity in the U.S. Has been, a key focus. One of the investigations that we did helped to free a young man last year before last. The pandemic has screwed up my sense of time here, but so I think national security reporting has obviously been something that the AP has done. In 2012, won the Pulitzer Prize for disclosing that the New York Police Department was spying on Muslim communities in the United States. So, again, those are like, major things that the AP investigative unit focus on. I mean, we don't really think about like just these are like areas that we're not. If there are good stories that come up in the course of the reporters reporting, then we will focus on those. We go through a process, we think it through, we think, can we show the harm or can we show the wrongdoing? If so, can we prove it? Can we document it? We think about then once we've got those two off the checklist, then we tell a compelling story around it, because the thing that we really emphasize is the writing. So much of investigative journalism, I would say critically, is you put all your effort and energy into the reporting, and then you run out of steam when it comes to the writing. And we wanted to make sure that we really write and for our investigations.
So most of your investigations are team efforts. A lot of them?
A lot of them are,
Yeah.
but the reporters do individual stories as well. I've tried to team up our reporters with people across the AP, across the world, because I wanted to bring that investigative ethos to the entire AP, and not just be consolidated into like one team. So, we'll team up with people in bureaus around the world to try to do investigations. But yeah, I mean, we feel like got some, top notch, some of the best in the business. And so there are times where they have a story that they just do it on their own, but a lot of them are team efforts.
There's a question here from Liana Bravo, and her question is, are there opportunities to collaborate on AP investigations as a freelance data and investigative journalist?
There are some. We don't, because our team is so large, we don't use a lot of freelancers, but there have been times where we have. But for the most part, we've got nearly 30 people, which is larger than some newsrooms. So we don't do a lot of freelancers, but we do some if the opportunity presents itself.
But Ron, you've also done collaborations with other news organizations, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us about that. Yeah.
We've done collaborations with, the investigative documentary program Frontline. We've done with ICIJ. We've done it with NBC News. So we do collaborations with other news organizations around the world, actually, where we feel like there's an opportunity to really enhance reporting, or there's a great story that can be done. We did a collaboration with a group of Canadian news organizations a few years back, looking at water quality in Canada. So yeah, we will, if the opportunity presents itself and we think it's a good fit, we will collaborate with other news organizations.
And you've worked for the Times and other newspapers, and you're now with the AP. Is there a difference in the way in which newspapers or those types of news organizations work on investigations compared to wire agencies like the AP?
I don't think there's a difference in terms of how you work on an investigation. The techniques are the same. It's all journalism. I think the distribution is different, and that's the main thing for me. That was, as someone who's worked his entire life with like newspapers, coming to a news agency was trying to grasp how it works, and still confused sometimes too, because the AP is a B2B. So New York Times does an investigation, it goes on the New York Times website, it goes into New York Times physical paper, and they also have a service where they will push out stuff too, but that's not their main business model. Whereas the New York Times, the AP has 15,000 customers around the world. So it goes out and it goes everywhere. And the thing is, a lot of times, which I didn't realize until now, is that you will see stuff that is AP. You just don't know it's AP. So that's been the biggest difference for me, is just learning how AP operates and it's in terms of its distribution versus how the Times operates.
Does that mean there's a different way in which impact is made? You know, the way a story creates impact.
I think it does in some ways because, the story will appear in, the various publications around the world and it raises awareness, even if you're not clear that it's AP. And so, people are talking about it, but then I think it also drives the traffic to the AP's website, which is traditionally not where people go to get AP stories. I mean, you typically see it somewhere else, but it then drives, traffic there and people see it. And so they do understand that is Associated Press investigation, but we don't approach it that way. We do journalism in the same way that I did at the Times or other. Right? We do good work and hope that it raises awareness about a particular issue.
Well, the AP won the Public Service Award for Seafood from Slaves, which freed thousands of trafficked, basically slave workers in fishing boats in Southeast Asia. I mean, that's impact.
Yeah, and excuse me. And I think that the power of that story was because it was able to go to so many places, and that you could see it in all of these different forms, even if people didn't know it was the AP. But I think that's a perfect example of why this distribution model is really powerful in amplifying the investigation, because again, people will see this, raises awareness for ordinary citizens, for policymakers, and it definitely has impact. The palm oil investigation that we did this year as well. I just saw yesterday that the Malaysia was downgraded in the State Department's human trafficking because of their handling of labor abuses with on palm oil plantations. So that series of stories continues to reverberate across and have an impact.
I think those types of stories work very well for the AP model because you have correspondence throughout the region, and then you can find the US angle as well, right? Or how the food supply chain, slavery in Southeast Asia impacts on the food supply chain in the US.
Right. So I don't really think about the US as an audience per se by itself. When I approach an investigation and when reporters bring ideas to me, we think globally. And if it happens to impact the US, then sure. But we are a global news organization, so that's not the first thing that I think of. I'm looking at the labor abuses, and then if there's a way to bring it awareness of, like, if you're an American customer or citizen of the UK, and I can show you how this impacts you, then yeah, we will certainly try to show that. But I don't go into it thinking about how I can, I don't think about the US as just like, because again, I don't see the AP, even though it's based in the US, I don't see it as a US news agency in terms of my thinking of how we approach an investigation. I'm thinking globally all the time.
When thinking of stories, I mean, it's also important, I think, to have diverse people on your staff who will bring ideas to the table that are very different from others. There's a question here from one of our attendees, and they ask, I'd like to know how much progress you think has been made in terms of increasing representation in investigative media. Do you think there is a difference between games made in the US versus the UK, Europe, rest of the world?
So, I can speak to the US. I can't speak firsthand knowledge in the UK, but just in talking to friends and people that I know in the UK, I don't think there's been as much progress that needs to be made. And the same goes for the US. As you and I talked about, there are very few people of color in positions like my own. And that's unacceptable. Because I don't look at it like, well, we have to numerically have this many people of color. Now, I think that you're missing a lot of great talent if you're not looking at the full field of people that are out there. People who bring new ideas, people who bring, different perspectives, yes. But at the same time, these are people with enormous talent that you may be missing out on because your recruiting pool is the same as it's always been. So there's a lot to be done. I don't think we've made as much progress as we should. We go through these cycles because, the things that we're talking about now, the same things we were talking about in the 90s about how we need to do diversity and there was pushback and, there's always this thing of like, well, we don't want to lower the standards. And the question becomes like, why is there always like a question about standards when it comes to people of color? Which that just seems ridiculous to me, but that's one of the first things you hear. Well, we don't want to, but again, the two aren't connected. You want to get like the best people that you can possibly get because I'm competitive. I want the absolute best people that I can get. And I want to expand the field. So there are people who are like me who may not have even thought about this as a career, but definitely have the talent and the drive to be able to be an investigative reporter. And I think as media wants to grow and reach these new audience, you've got to bring in people from those other communities. You can't have a group of people who all think the same and who come from same backgrounds.
I mean, specifically, what have you been able to do in the past year in the AP, and what do you think you should be doing?
Well, I think there's a lot more to be done. I mean, we've certainly increased the diversity of our staff on the investigative team. We've also been able to expand by creating an investigative correspondence program where we bring in people from other teams and make them correspondents on the investigative team. We've created an internal fellowship at the AP for young journalists who have 3 years or less of experience to help them gain the skills to be investigative reporters. And then I'm a co-founder of, the Ida B. Wells Society, which is an NGO that tries to increase the number and retain journalists of color. So we've managed to partner with AP to bring funding for a fellowship that will turn into a full-time job for one person. We've also created an internship to bring young people of color into the AP to learn how to do investigative reporting. And when I do hires, I'm thinking much broader than just the traditional places where we've gone to look. And also in terms of diversity, because AP is a global news organization, I'm thinking, who can I hire in Europe? Who can I hire in the African continent? Who can I hire in Asia? I don't want to just send Americans or Europeans to those places. I want to hire people who are there, who are natives of those places. Because I think that's important, particularly for a global news organization.
So there's a question from Simona Matache. Do you have any recommendations for aspiring investigative reporters who are just about to graduate?
Mm-hmm. I would say that reach out to people like myself, pick their brains on how they started, what skills you need, and just establish a relationship with them. Get mentors that can help you navigate this area, because the thing is, you don't want to start out just sort of asking around to figure out how to do this on your own. There are people who have gone through this, who may have been in similar circumstances. Reach out to them, establish those relationships, get those mentors, and let them guide you.
I have another question here from Nicole Tan, and she asks, is there a general recipe when carrying out investigations? Can you give us an outline for what journalists are looking out for when pursuing a story?
It varies from investigation to investigation because it all depends on what you're doing. Some are really document heavy, where you've got a ton of documents. Some are more source heavy, where there are no documents and you have to depend on sources. As I said, for us, the main things that we look at are, can you show that there's wrongdoing, or can you show that there is harm? And if so, can you document it? Can you document it with sources? Can you document it with data? Can you document it with data? And once you are able to answer those first two things, now what you're thinking about is like, what's the potential impact here? And then the last thing is, are there characters that in your reporting that you could build the story around? That's the essence of an AP investigation. So, but it varies again from investigation to investigation, because sometimes you're working on something, and like national security, for instance, or just intelligence, there's no data, there's no documents, and you just gotta depend on the sources. But these are sources that sources that you vetted. And other times you've got an abundance of documents that you wade through. So there's no one way of actually doing an investigation.
What about security considerations? The world is increasingly an unsafe and often hostile place for journalists, especially investigative journalists. What are your security concerns? And I also want to put in a question here from one of the attendees, and saying they're interested to know how the AP works to ensure information security across borders. Do you have your own in-house trainers and experts? Do you have a training program?
So I guess we're talking physical security and digital security. Okay, so for physical security, we actually have a department that has people throughout the various regions in the US. Our head of security, vice president for security, is a former Secret Service agent who he has designed the security program and the physical security program for our reporters. There's a process that we go through before we send people into areas, and we weigh the pros and cons of that. In terms of digital security, we actually have a digital security team too, that deals with all aspects of, like, if we're reporting in countries that we think may be monitoring our communications, we have some secure communication tools that we use to make sure that information is secure. So we have the two separate teams, one for digital security and one for physical security.
Do you see that as a major challenge? For example, when you're looking at slave labor and going to the field where some nasty illegal stuff is being done.
Yeah, and it's tough because there's only so much you can do in reporting the palm oil. The reporters had to sneak people off those plantations, meet with them in the forest, or go onto the plantations without being, you know, caught there. And, we could not list the names of our reporters in the region on the story. So we couldn't credit them at all. And we've done that in a number of countries where there's no byline on the story for the safety of the reporters there. So it's a huge challenge, and one that keeps me up at night, worried about people when they go and, there's like one instance where went 3 days without hearing from people because their sat phone broke down. And I was just, panicked the entire time until, we finally heard from them. But it is something that is first and foremost on my mind all the time when we send people into these situations.
So there's a question here from Yves Laurent, and it is, what is, from your perspective, one of the main challenges that investigative journalism is facing today? Does the pandemic revealed any other challenges? Has the pandemic revealed any other challenges?
I think the major focus is and this has long been true in some countries, but I think even in these countries that we consider free, there's been this push against the press by leaders in those countries, and you're seeing, for me, I feel like there's a growing movement of this, because even we look at the Trump years in the U.S., for instance, and he's calling the press the enemy of the people and those types of things, but people forget that the Obama administration also went after journalists too. And so there was no golden age with the Obama administration. My former colleague, Jim Risen at the New York Times, they were threatening him with jail. So, I think that is something that we are constantly facing with governments everywhere. And that, to me, I think has been exacerbated during the pandemic, but it's always been there. So I that's what I think is the biggest challenge, that even though these governments that appear to be friendly to press freedoms and open to transparency, there's still issues there.
There's a question here from Perseverance Javangwe. Any advice for investigative journalists working in an environment where they are harassed or receive serious threats from political leaders?
Yeah, but it's a really long answer, and I would be more than happy if you want to shoot me an email at rnixon@ap.org. I'll be happy to discuss it more, because that's a really long and involved answer. But yeah, shoot me an email and I'd be happy to discuss it more with you.
So, Ron, what is your outlook for investigative journalism in the future? In the next 5 years, how is investigative reporting going to change in the techniques of information gathering, presentation, audience, the landscape of threats? Look into your crystal ball. What do you see?
Well, I think that things like, Bellingcat, with OSINT investigations that have really changed how we, what's considered data, and what's considered like, the information that we use to tell a story. And forensic architecture and groups like that that exist to sort of do recreations of that, I think will become more mainstream there are people who are doing it now, like the BBC, the New York Times, the Post. We've done some, but I think what you will see is that more news organizations will do that because the technology gives us the ability to do more and more of that now. And I think, you know, for people like Bellingcat, giving us the skill sets to do that. I've sent a lot of my team to Bellingcat trainings to be able to do those kinds of things. So I think that will become, you know, more mainstream than it is now, and it won't be seen as this exotic thing like when you see the New York Times investigative visual investigations, and you think, oh wow, that's cool, but we don't have the thing to do that. But you will see more and more of that. I think, you know, animation and those types of things will become more and more a part of what we do. Is something that I know I've been thinking about, how we can incorporate more of that, and just the way that a story is told with the blending of words and video and graphics, and that I think will, again, as we pull further and further away from the paper, the physical paper, and consume this information on, that will be even more critical now to be able to tell the story. Because when we approach a story, we are thinking not only like what the word's going to say, but how do we tell the story visually, and the presentation is not just a presentation, but becomes part of the storytelling. And I think that will become standard from. You're muted too.
Is the AP thinking, you know, AP publishes through others? It's a B2B business, as you said, but are you now, do you have a presence, for example, in social media? Do you see social media platforms as also a platform for the kind of storytelling you're talking about?
I do. And I think that, you know, it will take on even more importance over time. I mean, you know, things like Twitter and Facebook can be toxic at times, but they're also good tools that can expand to a wider audience. I mean, obviously there's some, you know, like AP itself is doing a review of our social media policies. I know other news organizations are looking at those too, to make sure that it still aligns with the journalism, but at the same time taking advantage of the power of these platforms.
Ron, there's a question here about the AP's fact-checking process. Well, how do you fact-check your investigations? Yeah.
Oh, wow. So we have a pretty involved bulletproofing sessions that's we call that line by line editing. Several days before a story is supposed to run, I sit with the team that worked on the investigation and the editor that worked on the investigation, and we literally go line by line on every fact that's in the story. And you have to provide documents to me to show how you know what you have written in the story. And even like with the name, you need to be able to produce something public that I can see that the name is it. We go through the transcripts of the interview to see that the quote is not taken out of context, that, you know, it represents what the person was saying. We go through the data that you have. We sit through, and if you got that data, show me how you arrived at that. Show me the formula that you used so you have to save your formulas. You have to save your queries for the stories that you've done in your either your database, or if you're using R or something like that. I want to see how you arrived at what you arrived at. And it's a process, because that's not even before the lawyers get it. That's just me. So we go through that for the major story. That's the breaking news story like January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do that. But for things like palm oil and others, we go through that process, which helps me sleep better at night because I don't know about other people, but I always get butterflies before something runs. But it helps me sleep a lot better knowing that we've gone through that process. And if you have something in a story and you can't really show me how you did it, it comes out. I don't care how great the quote is. I don't care how great the data point is. It comes out.
So Ron, we're nearly out of time, but I'll give you the last word. Some parting thoughts about global investigative journalism at this point in time.
Well, I think what you're seeing now is more awareness of investigative journalism in other places. And it gives you an appreciation for what other people are going through under much more difficult circumstances than we have in the US. And I look at some of the great investigative journalism in South Africa on state capture, in Namibia, around the fish rot scandals in the Namibian. I think that what you will see more and more is that ICIJ model of people collaborating across borders. I think you're seeing a lot more of that. And I think that will become the norm over time as news organizations struggle with resources and people, that it will mandate that we partner with other people across the world. I do think that there are some challenges in terms of funding that we will all have to contend with on the commercial side, but even with philanthropy, because philanthropy is just the flip side of commercial, and that donors, their minds change about the things that they think are important. So we have to contend with those things too, and look for different business models. I don't think anybody has shown what will work across media yet. I think what works for the New York Times is not necessarily going to work for other people. So those are the major challenges that I see, but there are some great opportunities too, because you see organizations like BuzzFeed, for instance, that didn't exist when you and I were coming up as journalists. So there's some great opportunities, but there's still a lot of impediments, I think, out there.
Well, thank you so much, Ron Nixon, for talking about global investigative reporting in your own career. Very inspiring. And thank you to our audience for their questions and for tuning in.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ron and Sheila, and thank you everyone for coming. We have 2 more days of CIJ Summer. Please check out our website, tcij.org, and there are more free talks. Come along. They're free to attend. You can do it from the comfort of your home. You have nothing to